So let's just start with the state of the South African economy. So I've just collected a bit of data on where we are in terms of growth. And what I try and show is, you cannot see, but on the red is really just the fluctuations over the last 20-year period on GDP growth. But the story is that we're not growing. Growth is very timid. Growth is inadequate to deal with our social problems. But what we want to point out is, despite the meager growth that we have had, it hasn't been sufficient to deal with the massive problem of unemployment. Last year, we saw real GDP contracting. There were a lot of estimations made that our growth will be over 1.5, 1.8%, which, by the way, was not so great. But even those all had to be revised downward. The World Bank, IMF, even Treasury had to revise downward our projections to less than 1% growth. We currently had 0.7% growth. This year, we're projecting growth to look at 1.3%. Inflation we've been able to contain, and that's that blue line there. Most emerging markets, these are your BRICS economies, they're doing better than developed economies, who are growing at just over 2%. We see emerging markets growing over 4%, between 4 and 6% growth rate, depending on the country. South Africa is clustered with developing economies, and yet our growth capabilities are nowhere near. Subsectors that over the last decade, we look at value-adding sectors, which I believe is core to many of BRICS economies' growth. If you unpack where they've grown in subsectors, primarily it's gross value-adding sectors, sectors where they've improved their productivity, increased their output and their ability to export some of those goods and processing. Primarily over the last few years or 2 decades, agriculture has really contracted. Mining is that light orange that you see to your right-hand side on the graph, but you see there as well. Various fluctuations, primarily because of exchange rate and currency fluctuations. But a big issue with mining, we know, if you unpack whether it's coal, platinum, iron ore, which are big products in our market, is the issue of commodity prices. So what is the situation with poverty and inequality in South Africa? Again, we're leading in the wrong thing. So we know that from the Gini coefficient side, which I haven't put here, that we're the most unequal society globally. There's more than 30 million of our population living on less than 992 Rand a month. This is a problem, right? And the share of the bottom 40% earn only 8.3% of our total income. This is the inequality that I'm referring to. This is not sustainable. Growth is consumption-driven in South Africa, but based on what? So the fundamentals that you see is that we have a very much indebted middle class. We speak a lot of the middle class, but it's highly indebted. This middle class is not necessarily producing or active necessarily in terms of growing the enterprise sector or enterprise. It's highly indebted, and you see that through SARB numbers that show our middle class in the last since 2000 have increased from, this is the household debt ratios to income, from 54% to 76%. People are in debt. We see that the number of people or dependents on the fiscus has risen from 3 to 17 million. Again here, this is a warning bell. But primarily, it's not in the Gauteng province and the Western Cape. So my recommendation when you look at this is to say, what can be done in some of the less developed provinces to ensure that not just migration is reduced, but the dependency on cash transfers is reduced. And I think economic activity around those regions and creating networks has to happen. And I make recommendations towards the end. So we know, generally speaking, a lot of economic theory talks to how unemployment definitely drives poverty. Strong linkages between the two. You have to ensure that the South African youth are enabled to enter into tertiary or post-grad or post-high school qualification. But now it could either be in your normal graduate colleges, or we could look at the vocational education programs, which is a possibility. And I think that's something we need to focus on. So unemployment drives poverty, but education drives employability. But I think the view of South Africa and the view of Africa as a continent has really changed over time. What I show you here is the economists' view on what they have thought of us. So this is global view and perspectives from them. So I take some of their headlines and what they've said about us. In 2000, they said we are a hopeless continent. And then you move to 2002, and they talk about sustaining our development, and 2003. Now, time for Africa, George Bush's new mission. And the question that I have is, how long will we allow other external parties to drive what we think of ourselves, not just as South Africans, but as Africans in general? You see here that there's a massive trend. So you see there that the highlight is 1960, that first decade. You can then see some of the things that have happened from a structural perspective in our economy. So you see there that the primary sector contributed almost 30%, 27.5% to our output, right? That's almost a third. But what has happened over time? Over time, it has declined. You see there that from 27.5 to 10.3% has been the decline. So you can see that agriculture as well hasn't necessarily done as well as it should, combined with forestry and fishing. These are some of the subsectors that are highly labor intensive, which you should focus on given the type of economy that we have. From the totality perspective, although we've increased by 2%, we have deindustrialized as a country. This is where most BRICS economies have put emphasis. Your primary sector, they've moved out of primary sector to secondary, adding value, increasing exports, improving their terms of trade, making sure that they don't have current account deficits. We are still grappling with this 50 years later because you see primary and secondary sectors largely contracting. Our tertiary industry we see has risen. You see that from 51.6 to around 70%, largely on the back of wholesale and retail trade. You see there that that increase attributed primarily to trade and also to your fire sector. And this is where growth has primarily happened in South Africa. But what happens in the tertiary sector is that you've got to have high level of skills to be employed there. We hear year on year out about the budget. We'll hear in a few weeks our Minister of Finance talk to the budget. But primarily, Africans in South Africa is no different. You see in that black line there that talks to our revenue and our non-interest spending is at the top. We're always spending more than we can collect. I think it's time that we stop spending more than we earn, despite our background and our history. So the debt to GDP outlook doesn't look positive. That dotted line there is the revised outlook from late last year in October from the budget statement. And you see there that from the estimated line at the bottom over time, so we've revised 2018 numbers from 55.1 to 55.8 upwards to 56.1 for the following year. And it goes on to 58 up until 60. By the way, there's a threshold. Debt at some point begins to have a regressive effect on your economy. So once you go over around, economists argue, but around 60% or more, it may not have a positive effect, depending on what you use it for and also your debt servicing costs as a nation. So our gross debt estimate is estimated up to 59.6%. And that's the peak that you will likely reach in the next five years, because Treasury has estimates of around that. Where do we want to go as a country? I show you here the fastest growing economies in the world over the last 3 years. And you see there that over time, 6 of these are African countries, primarily driven by development of their primary and secondary sectors. So none of these economies have less than 7% growth, and the fastest being Ethiopia at 8.5%. And I believe that we can learn a lot. Some of these were highly indebted, poor countries, and they had debt relief from the IMF in the last decade, and they've used that well. Instead of borrowing more, they've actually used it well to make use of this to ensure that they boost subsectors in their primary and secondary sectors and tiers of the economy, and that is how they've been able to maintain this. And I think there's structural things that we can follow as a country and put in place, but I also think governance is a big one. So there is hope. This is what I want to say. Countries do get it right. Business needs to invest. Our proportion of growth has been increasing very minimally, and less than 3% year on year. We need to push that number up. We need to improve our productivity, and it'll increase our output, driving up our own growth. So if you look at the economy, there's 4 underpinning things that actually drive South Africa's economy. The first being consumption, and I've already spoken to the high level of debt. Listen, it's not just you who is borrowing. The government is full in debt. Everybody's in debt. Government, you, everyone. So you see consumers are in debt. Government is in debt. It's increasing year on year, and that's the SARB is just showing us that from 1990 to current levels, we're increasingly reliant on debt. And this is what's driving growth. Largely, we have a very low savings culture. Our savings rate are between 14 and 18% in South Africa. We are not saving enough. Therefore, we rely on capital inflows that are highly volatile to sustain our investment levels, and this is inadequate. China's a new game changer on the continent and even here. We know that our own state utility has borrowed from China in terms of Eskom. What you see here is just the interest that China has in Africa. Their development is very much pinned to debt. And they're lending to many of our African brothers and sisters, including us. And so in terms of government, we know that, I believe that even though markets generate growth and inequality, but those who start ahead will always be ahead. Left to its own devices, it will tend to increase, therefore government intervention is necessary. So we need to look at ways to improve this. One of them is to improve our trade. Improve our trade balance, export more, focus on subsectors, look at how logistics and some of the underpinning areas that can enable us to trade better as a country with other economies, even in intra-Africa trade. We're not doing so well on intra-Africa trade as a continent, and I believe that with the CTA, we could potentially see higher levels of trade, improving trade across Africa, but our biggest trading partners still remain the EU, the OECD economies. For you to have 4% growth over a specified period of time, you've got to have 23 to 25% level of investment in a country. Ours over the last decade has been around 18%. You see that line there is the average over that time. It's telling you that our investment levels have to be pushed up, and we're not getting enough FDI or foreign flow in. I definitely believe that we have a lot of hope, even in this country. I think that there are a lot of policy fundamentals that are in place. We've got to deal with the issue of poverty. We've got to deal with the issue of unemployment, but how do we get there? So there's 4 things that I point out. We need to have African models for our economies. Our economies are largely resource-based, but we have to have a sectoral focus. We've got to build competitive advantage. We need to look at how to diversify our exports even further, but underpinning all of that is a very strong logistics, transport, rail, and road infrastructure that enable cheaply goods to be moved. The second thing is you need good governance. It's a game changer. And then you've got to mobilize resources, but I think we've got to do it differently. We've got to stop borrowing from the IMF. We've got to look at municipal bonds. We've got to look at changing our pension funds and how we use them for infrastructure. Now, I'm not saying take money from the PIC and give it to politicians to build roads. No. You can create securitized debt. You can ensure that there's an asset class that is developed, that has governance, that has models, special purpose vehicles. Europe, Canada, some Latin American countries, even America, use specific bonds around infrastructure development using their pension funds because of the long-term asset liability matching that pension funds hold. And this is important for us because we can use our own domestic investment to build our economies. Microfinance. We've got to look at the masses of our informal employed population. And mobile technology, I believe, is a game changer for improving access as well. And then lastly, human capital. Unless we build human capital, that youth will lead to an Arab uprising. So we've got to ensure that vocational skills have to be a focus. I know Professor Nadozi might focus on that. Listen, we talk 4th industrial revolution. Until you get the basic rights at the primary level on this, making sure that we have teachers who can teach science and maths, making sure that we have more women in technology, more women and young girls in sciences and engineering and mathematics, because they're the greater proportion of the population, we will not see the type of South Africa and Africa that we need. So with that, I'm going to end and say, Professor Andre Roux, he creates this futuristic model to say, the type of future we want is based on how well we're able to diversify our economy and how effective we have our governance systems. And I've stolen this from him. And if we want to end up in the African Renaissance, we've got to get our act together. We can end up here, the resource curse, where we have massive rent-seeking behavior, or you can end up in the other two, but where you have diminishing returns to scale, unhealthy labor force, underinvestment, basically stagnation. This is not where we want to end up. But you've got to take means and measures and methods to try and get yourself into the la-la land, which is African Renaissance here, which leads to massive productivity, output growth, stability from a political environment, but this requires you and I to have a mindset change. And this requires business, labor, academics, education, civil society to all work together in an integrated fashion to actually ensure that South Africa reaches her full destiny. Thank you very much.